Thanks to everyone for coming out tonight. What a thrill it is for me. As Don mentioned, this is the third event now. Batting 3 for 3, I would say. This is my third book, third event at Busboys and Poets. I mean, it doesn't get much better than that. I'm very, very excited to be back here in Washington, where I used to live from 2001 until 2003, and it's so exciting to see a number. Actually, I can't see any of you because of the lighting here tonight. I'll just have to suspend disbelief and imagine you out there. But I have seen, since I walked through the gates of Busboys and Poets this evening, I have seen several of my old friends from my old DC days and many different stages of my life. It's great to see all of you here tonight, and I want to thank, as Don mentioned, there are several co-sponsors of this event tonight that I think are very significant, and I applaud Busboys and Poets for making that a point of these events, to get people on board and invested in turning out a crowd and spreading the word about these discussions. It's absolutely critical. As someone who organizes such events and panel discussions and conferences essentially for a living, I can say that it really makes a difference. And I'm just going to add a friendly amendment. Don mentioned that the publisher of our book is Boston Review. Just to sort of explain that a little bit more carefully, the publisher of the book is actually MIT Press, but the imprint or the series within MIT Press that this book has been published is called Boston Review Books. And for those not familiar with Boston Review, it's a 6 times a year magazine that comes out of MIT, but that's co-edited by the very, very prominent political theorist Joshua Cohen and Deb Chasman. It's an excellent publication. I highly encourage you to take a look at it if you're not familiar with it. And they publish a series of books, of short, quick, timely books that are meant to be critical interventions in the central debates of our time. And that's exactly how this book came about. So it is a co-production, if you will, a co-publication of Boston Review and MIT Press. And I want to thank Free Syria and also the think tank that Radwan runs, the Syrian Center for Strategic and Political Studies here in Washington. Let me just say a little bit about the book itself as a book, and then I'm going to hand things over to my three co-panelists this evening. So how did this book come about, and why is it called The Syria Dilemma? As Don graciously mentioned, Nader and I run a center together called the Center for Middle East Studies at the University of Denver. And it's a new center. It's just about a year old now. When it started, we agreed that we would do one big conference per year. And we started the center just over a year ago in the fall of 2012. And there was absolutely no debate, no discussion, no soul-searching about what our first conference was going to be on. We decided, even before I got to Denver, we were just emailing back and forth while I was still in Chicago, packing my boxes, getting ready to move to Denver to work with Nader at the center. We had to do our first conference on Syria because Syria posed such a human nightmare and such an intellectual puzzle. What was the answer? What are the different positions? Why is there no clear consensus on what should be done? We were both obsessed with this problem for many, many months. We emailed each other probably 6, 7, 8, 9 articles a day, back and forth, constantly trying to figure out the chessboard, who stands where are the ideological fault lines, what, to paraphrase a classic question, what is to be done? And so the very first thing we set out to do when I got to Denver and we launched our Center for Middle East Studies was we decided there's only one thing we really can do, and we're in a great position to do it. Let's invite 25 of the smartest people in the world who have the most insightful, knowledgeable things to say about Syria. Let's invite them to Denver for 2 days, lock them in a room, and make them hash this out and see what happens. And that's exactly what we did. In January, in fact, exactly 1 year ago, almost to the day, in January of 2013, we assembled the most interesting minds and thinkers, scholars, area experts, journalists, humanitarian activists, human rights leaders, Syrian opposition figures, political scientists, historians, and we held 5 panels over 2 days on every dimension of the Syrian crisis. The internal politics and the history. Where did this come from? Where did the uprising come from? Why did it start? What are its constituent elements? What are the regional politics of the Syrian conflict? How does the Cold War between Iran and Saudi Arabia impact the Syrian conflict? What are the geopolitical dimensions of the Syrian conflict? And then we had our keynote session, which was really on the big picture and the very practical question of how does one resolve this conflict? What is to be done about it? And on that panel, we had a number of thinkers. Ken Roth from Human Rights Watch, who's in the book, Richard Falk, the long time, going back half a century now, leading advocate of peace and human rights, international law scholar. And we had Rafif Jouejati of the local coordination councils of Syria, who unfortunately couldn't join us tonight because it's her son's birthday. She has a very good excuse for not being here, but Rafif was at the conference and is in the book. And Free Syria, the nonprofit organization, the foundation that she helps run, is a co-sponsor of this evening's event. So Rafif is very much here in spirit. And Michael Ignatieff, leading figure of humanitarian intervention debates of the 1990s, leader of the Liberal Party, former leader of the Liberal Party in Canada. And we debated this question, what is to be done? And then we set out and thought, okay, should we just do a book based on the conference? And you know, I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with conference books. They're stillborn. They're a dead letter. They tend to be rather boring books. And we didn't want to do that kind of a book. And it would also take 9 to 12 to 18 months to come out. And we thought, well, what's the point of doing that? Because most of what's in that book is going to be irrelevant by the time it gets out. The situation on the ground in Syria is shifting so rapidly. We need to do a much more sharply focused, much more timely book that's going to come out much more quickly, and that's going to have a much clearer focus on one central question, which is what is to be done? What's the answer? The reason, so we just focused on that one question, and we assembled approximately 22 pieces focused on that one question. And that is essentially the book in front of you, The Syria Dilemma. Now, why is it called The Syria Dilemma, rather than here's what should be done about Syria? Now, Nader and I are of different views on this. He has a sort of revisionist history of the origins of this book. He's essentially disowned the whole concept of the book now. So please know that all of the profits to the book should be earmarked for me, since he's essentially written it off, all of the negative $5,000 that we're making on this book. But in all seriousness, the word dilemma is not an accident. The fundamental starting point of our project was that there is no obvious, clear-cut solution to the Syrian nightmare. However, it is indeed a nightmare that demands of us the deepest, most self-critical, probing thinking and challenging engagement that we can possibly summon. Because this is, in fact, the worst moral, humanitarian, political catastrophe of the 21st century. We have to figure out what can be done to stop this catastrophe. And so the book has not two positions. It's not a for and against book. If you really mapped it out, there's probably about 17 different positions in the book amongst the 22 contributors. It's not just a book about should there be intervention, should there not be intervention. There are all sorts of debates and positions in the book. There are arguments for humanitarian intervention in the book. There are arguments against it. There are arguments for arming the opposition in Syria. There are arguments against it. You will hear some of those arguments tonight. There are arguments for a diplomatic, negotiated political settlement in the book. There are arguments. One of my favorite essays in the book is by the humanitarian scholar and longtime anti-war activist Mary Kaldor at the LSE, who argues for what she calls a humanitarian strategy in Syria focused on civilians. She argues that too much of the debate on Syria has drifted towards which side are you on, how to topple the regime, which faction to support. She said, let's get back to the original logic of humanitarian law and focus on civilians and protecting civilians. So she ends up arguing for what she calls the establishment of a no attacks on civilians zone or zones. I think it's one of the most unique and fascinating arguments in the book and in fact, the Syria debate more generally, and I strongly encourage you to read it. I strongly encourage you to read the entire book, but the essay by Richard Falk really means a lot to me because Richard Falk, for those of you familiar with him, you know that Richard has spent the last half-century as a human rights scholar, a scholar of international law, an anti-war activist, a voice for self-determination. Richard really struggles in the book. Richard wrote 3 or 4 different blog posts. If you don't know his blog, it's really exceptional. You can just find it on Googling Richard Falk blog. But Richard, it's a very deeply self-reflective, self-critical essay where he basically struggles with the conflict between, on the one hand, the humanitarian nightmare in Syria that demands some answer of us, that demands some sort of action, and yet struggling with the legacy of intervention and the possible catastrophic consequences of intervention, foreign intervention. And he argues in a sense that this is a tragedy, that there is actually, that the position of doing nothing, although there are many arguments that would lead one against taking action, that he argues that the position of inaction is actually a tragic one that would leave the situation in a bloodbath that is simply unacceptable from the point of view of internationalism, solidarity, and human rights. It's a very, very gripping essay, and he changes his position. He actually came to Denver with one view, and after that 2-day conference in which he participated, he rethought a lot of his previous thinking on Syria, and his essay, in effect, works through these contradictions, this self-reflective process. It's a fascinating piece. So that is, in essence, why we did this book and why it's called The Syria Dilemma, because Syria is indeed a dilemma. It poses a series of deeply challenging questions to all of us, not only to nation states and international bodies like the UN, but to those of us, people of conscience, human beings, citizens of the world, internationalists, progressives, humanists, however one wants to think of oneself. The nightmare in Syria today is something that weighs on us heavily. And with those thoughts, I will hand things over to three of the authors of the finest contributions to the book. Radwan Ziadeh, Marc Lynch, and Nader Hashemi, and then we'll move to a discussion because we want to hear what you think. Radwan.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you for Danny. Thank you for Danny, and thanks, of course, for Nader. I'm very glad to be here. I have 5 to 7 minutes. Tried actually to answer to one question, since not only an academic and participants in the book, but more as a Syrians and looking for his countries falling apart. The question always struck me, and we are getting into the 4th year of the Syrian revolution, which turned to be a Syrian tragedy. In all numbers can speak on itself. In the back of the book, you will see that the current conflict in Syria has killed more than 90,000. Now the number is more than 150,000 who's been killed since the uprising started on March 2011. The question why we never learned from history. I mean, Syria is not unique, and what's happened there happened in many countries, where actually a popular revolution started there, a response from a dictatorship, and we ended up into an armed conflict with no, of course, balance in powers between the armed opposition and the current Assad government. At the same time, the internal politics within the Security Council always gives the green light to the Assad government to continue its attack on our people. What's unique here, of course, was in two situations. The number of casualties, which of course much higher than any other normal civil war, because if we compare what's happening in Syria to the normal civil war, let's have in Peru in Latin America, between the Shining Path in 1980 until 2000, which left more than 70,000 to be killed in 20 years. Now in Syria, less than 3 years, we have more than 150,000. Of course, because that's the type of the weapons has been used, especially by the Air Force. And maybe you are aware of in the news about the barrel bombs, which bombarding the Aleppo neighboring and civilian areas every day, which left more than 1,000 to be killed in less than a week. Of course, this type of bombs, it's barrel bombs, it's just normal barrels and full of TNT, and just to throw it to the population there, because the Assad government knows exactly they will not be able to control those areas anymore, just make it impossible for anyone to live there. And that's exactly the case of dropping all of these barrel bombs every day. In my hometown in Daraya, born in Daraya, it's 7 kilometers south of Damascus. Daraya, we have a population of almost 240,000. Only 1,000 now left and living in the city. All of them left into Lebanon, Jordan, my mother in Turkey, my brother in Jordan, my sister in Lebanon. And this is the case of every Syrian family now. And now actually there is no people living in the city, and today dropped 7 barrel bombs in the city of Daraya. I mean, this is the type of the massive attack against the population. It should give us some lessons how actually to respond to that. We had that before in former Yugoslavia during Milosevic years, and we had before, of course, during Muammar Gaddafi in Libya in recent years. But we have the same type of characters of leaders like Bashar al-Assad, who decided actually to go far in killing its own people, and then the international community or the world not to do anything actually to stop that. That's creative. But what's happened before in Yugoslavia and in other places in Rwanda, the international community respond in building the International Criminal Code, responsibility to protect doctrine and others, which apply to Syria but's never been implemented. And this is why ended up exactly like we have the same normal situation where the international community has never been built, and a system or a justice system to be able to address all of these atrocities, war crimes and crimes against humanity. And the second issue, that's how we be able now to address the humanitarian crisis. Of course, now Syria getting into very deep humanitarian crisis. Half of the population are in need, especially in displaced areas. And of course, because the besieged has been the Assad regime putting besiege in many areas, not allowing any food or any water to get through. Especially in Yarmouk area, which the Palestinian refugees in my hometown in Daraya, Muaddamiyya, and Istir Ghouta, and in Homs and in other areas. And unfortunately, there is no response. You see that this getting in the news every day, and there is no response, even that's from the United States or from the international community to address. And this is the feeling among the Syrians right now, that the international community has abandoned us, lifting us to be killed, to be died in all different ways, through barrel bombs, through Scud missiles, through chemical attacks in Eastern Ghouta, and now through starvation. And the international community decided not to do anything to stop the slaughtering house that the Assad put the Syrian people there. And this is why, which makes it important for the questions how to deal with such a crisis in the future, because I think the Syrian crisis will not be the last one, and we should learn lessons about that, because what we thought that we built a system of the international justice system to be able to address was failed exactly in the Syrian questions. This is why it's if we did not get the lessons exactly from Syria, from Syrian case, we'll find in the future more Syrians, and we'll end it up by here. Thank you very much.
All right, thanks. First up, I'd also like to thank Danny and Nader for putting this book together, and also for their tireless efforts to promote reasoned civil discourse on this subject. I've known Radwan Ziadeh for many, many years. We disagree quite strongly on the question of whether the West should intervene in Syria, and I think we've been on about, 10 panels together over the last 2 years, and I think we always have good, reasoned discussions. The last time Radwan and I were on a panel together was at Lehigh University, and at that time, a group of pro-Assad Syrians came to the event wearing Bashar al-Assad T-shirts and waving Syrian flags, chanting and disrupting the event, and they actually threatened to kill Radwan several times, both publicly and privately. I figured this can't be worse than that. It's interesting to go back and look at this book and the way that the debate was at the time that most of these essays were assembled, and I'm curious what Nader's recantation of the book is. And so I'll be curious to hear that, because in my view, I think that no reasonable person can disagree with the assessment that this is one of the worst humanitarian tragedies, not just in the Middle East, but really in the 20th century, and therefore in history. And it's not just the number of dead. I actually think the number of dead is a very poor judge of the nature of the Syrian war. You can say 150,000. That doesn't really tell you about civilians versus combatants. It doesn't tell you what you need to know, which is the utter and complete destruction of an entire society and the devastation of cities, of villages, the descent into anarchy, and the savagery of the killing between communities that used to live together, and just the sheer psychological, humanitarian, and societal trauma which is afflicting an entire generation. It's not just the 150,000 dead, it's the 5 to 7 million, probably more at this point, displaced and refugees who are not going to forget what has happened to them and who are going to be bearing the scars of this for generations to come. And it's not going to be easy to put it back together, no matter what anybody does. And that's why I applaud the work that Radwan does on transitional justice so profoundly, because recording and paying testimony to what has been done is going to be an important part of moving beyond that. With all of that said, I think that there's basically two points that I want to make. The first is that I think that there's a profound difference in the debates that this book mostly documents, which were over the course of 2011 and the first half of 2012, and debates about what is happening in Syria since, I would say, roughly June of 2012. I think that certainly my contribution in the volume was written against arming the Free Syrian Army at a time when it must have been in like February or so, February of 2012. And this was a time when this was not yet a fully fledged insurgency and not yet a fully fledged civil war. There was a profound mix between peaceful civil uprisers being crushed by a genocidal regime and an incipient insurgency which was looking for arms abroad. And my argument against arming the Free Syrian Army at the time was a mix of things. One is simply that the historical record shows quite clearly that the strategy of arming arming proxy war, that arming groups from abroad in the civil war type conflict has very predictable effects, and from a wide range of comparative cases. When you start arming rebel groups, it generally tends, according to the political science literature on wars, it generally tends to make wars longer, bloodier, and harder to resolve. It is extremely uncommon. In fact, it's difficult to find a single case in history where simply arming a group on the ground has managed to lead to the overthrow and then the subsequent establishment of any kind of decent regime in the targeted country. What typically happens is that arms flow into rebel groups, making them just strong enough to not be defeated by the regime, but never making them quite strong enough in order to defeat the regime. What's more, they tend to be then captured by the interests of their foreign backers, which are not the same as the interests of the groups on the ground. And as they become increasingly dependent upon the flow of guns and money from outside, they then become more dependent and more subservient to those external interests because it's the only way that they can survive. And as a result, they have less and less incentive to compromise, to cooperate, or to stop the fighting. And that's the basic objection at the time was the same as what we have seen manifest profoundly over the last year and a half, as the United States has, in my view, wisely opted to not openly and overtly arm the Free Syrian Army, but everybody else has. And in fact, the argument that I was having back in February of 2012 has long since stopped mattering in any meaningful way, because they were armed. And by the summer of 2012, insurgency had fully taken over what had begun as a civil uprising. And in a sense, many of the arguments that we once had, I think, are largely moot. The conflict is obviously fully militarized. The men with guns are fully in charge. And the prospects of a diplomatic resolution are extraordinarily low. And what we've seen is, from near as I can tell, from, say, the collapse of the Kofi Annan peace mission in the summer of 2012 till now, very little has changed. There's largely a strategic stalemate. Assad is too strong to be overthrown and controls certain urban areas in the corridor to Latakia, and the opposition, and he's unable to establish his control over the rest of the country. The rest of the country is under the control of a, constantly changing balance of power between fragmented and divided rebel groups that are getting arms and support from abroad, and the Qataris and the Saudis and the Turks and the Jordanians and everybody else are fighting out their little proxy political battles through Syrian rebel groups. And we all, and I count myself in this, get really caught up in the day-to-day ups and downs, the rise of the Islamic Front or the Free Syrian Army and all of these things. This is basically these battles, this battles inside the rebellion between the different rebel groups is all very important in terms of what the opposition looks like and what what we might expect over the next 7 years. It does matter whether it's a jihadist insurgency or a secular insurgency, but at the fundamentals, this stalemate today is largely the same as what it was a year and a half ago. And this comes very much at the expense of the Syrian civilian population and what I was describing before. It also makes it virtually impossible to put an end to, because you have the so-called the presumed allies opposing Assad at odds with each other and constantly subverting each other. People look at the Syrian National Council, the Syrian Opposition Coalition, all of these opposition groups, and they throw up their hands at their inability to come to agreements, their inability to act, their inability to deliver, but it's not necessarily their fault, because in a sense, they are at the mercy of the structure that has been built up around them. I don't believe that there was ever anything which the United States would have been able to do within the bounds of what was actually being discussed, which would have made the situation substantively better. I think that there are many things we could have done which would have left the situation roughly the same as it is today, and a number of things we could have done which could have made it substantially worse. I think if we had done the policies that were primarily being discussed publicly, the Petraeus plan of arming the Free Syrian Army, even the more ambitious plans, like some of the ones that Radwan has talked about, of establishing no-fly zones or carrying out limited airstrikes against regime targets, I don't think any of these would have been adequate or sufficient to bring down Bashar al-Assad. I think all they would have done would have been more rapidly escalated the fighting to a higher level while attracting more support on the other side from Russia and Iran, and simply continuing the stalemate at a higher level of violence while keeping the United States, or getting the United States, ever more and more deeply embroiled and involved in the fighting. There were many people who thought at the time, I don't think Radwan was ever one of them, but there were people at the time who thought that at the first sign of NATO jets flying over Damascus, Bashar and his people would run for the hills. Clearly that was not right. Clearly this regime was far more resilient than opposition thinkers believed it was at the time, and everything I have seen that has happened over the last 2 years reinforces my strong belief that if we had gotten into a very limited intervention, the unbelievably small pinprick bombings, all that would have done would have been to get the United States involved without resolving the conflict. And once you're there, then what do? You're right back in those discussions of the slippery slope of having to then to do ever more to try and resolve this conflict that you're now trapped in. And I know nobody is ever talking about occupation. This was never supposed to be another Iraq. We're never supposed to talk about troops on the ground. But in my experience, once you start one of these things, it's extraordinarily hard to stop it. And political pressures become enormous to win a war that you have begun. And this would have been a war. Once you start bombing another country, it's a war. And so I think that if there had ever been a clear plan that showed that a limited U.S. intervention could have brought about a resolution to this humanitarian crisis, I'm pretty sure the administration would have done it. But they didn't, because such a plan was never offered to them. And that's why, even though things are terrible today in Syria, there's absolutely no reason that I can see to believe that things would be better there today if the United States had gotten involved, or if the West had gotten involved in the war at some earlier point, whether in the summer of 2011 or in the spring of 2012. Certainly not in August or September of last year. I think the reality, and I'll turn it over to Nader, but the reality is a truly horrible one, which is that this is likely to continue. I mean, basically what the comparative literature and what history teaches us about this kind of war, and when I say this kind of war, I mean a civil war with a regime that has a solid external patron and faces a large but fragmented and internally competitive opposition fueled by non-coordinated external support. These tend to last in the ballpark of 7 to 10 years, and I think that's probably what's going to happen with Syria. And Assad falling will likely only be a mark along the way in the continuation of that civil war. And this is deeply disturbing and deeply distressing, and yet I don't see from anybody anything which would substantially knock it off of that trajectory. The only thing which could possibly work at this point would be something which changes from the outside in, not from the inside out. There is no Syrian opposition capable of negotiating with the Assad regime, and there is no way that the Assad regime is going to negotiate itself out of existence. We can't affect those things. What we can affect is the external, trying to align and coordinate the foreign backers of the Syrian opposition, and trying to work with Russia and Iran to get them to force the Assad regime to the table. There might be an outside-in strategy to try and bring some kind of political transition. Frankly, the odds strike me as extremely low that this would actually work, but it's still greater than anything else that I can see on the table. And on that cheerful note, I'll hand it over to Nader.
Well, thank you all for coming tonight. I'm really glad that Marc went before me, because I think many of his descriptions of the Syrian conflict and what could have been done and how bad the options were at the beginning and have gotten even worse as the conflict has unfolded. His political prescriptions and diagnosis of the situation, while very convincing and very moving, is substantively different from what I have argued from the beginning of this conflict. There were no easy choices, but I think those people who, such as Marc and others, who made very convincing arguments that, look, if we were to intervene, there's no guarantee that we would have changed the conflict in a positive direction. All of those arguments, as convincing as they were and as they are to a certain extent, they all have consequences. And I think we are seeing the consequences of not getting involved in some meaningful way playing out before our eyes right now. Syria today, to quote from the UN High Commissioner for Refugees, represents the biggest humanitarian and moral crisis facing the planet. The figures are really staggering. Over 110,000 people killed, 40% of the population internally displaced or turned into refugees. The UN just reported last week that 38,000 people appealed to the UN for help because of various forms of sexual violence. So the human rights cost, the war crimes, the crimes against humanity, pretty clear and easy to see if you just read the documentation that has been collected. But there's also political costs and I think strategic costs to not getting involved that we have to face right now. And they're playing themselves out again before our eyes. Not only has Syrian society been decimated and destroyed, but Lebanon is now deeply destabilized as a direct result of the non-resolution of the Syrian conflict. Iraq, as we're seeing in Fallujah and Ramadi, are being destabilized. Jordan is deeply affected by the outflow and refugees. Reports are that the fourth largest city today in Jordan is a Syrian refugee camp. And you now have the rise of Al-Qaeda. Peter Bergen, who knows the Al-Qaeda story perhaps better than anyone, has just written a piece where saying that for the first time in really the history of Al-Qaeda, they control a swath of territory over 400 miles wide in the heart of the Middle East, spanning the Iraq-Syrian border. That's a consequence of the policy choices that were made and are being made. And on top of that, now Syria has become a magnet, has become a sort of a mini version of what Afghanistan was in the 1980s. Conservative reports, estimates suggest that over 1,200 people from various Muslim communities in Europe have come to Syria and have joined various extremist groups, primarily ISIS. And so now the Syrian conflict is having huge consequences for European security, for American security. There's a report in the New York Times last week about, Al-Qaeda elements in Syria trying to recruit Americans who have gone to Syria to come back here and perform various acts of terrorism. So these are some of the consequences of the choices that were made. And there were no easy choices, but I think we also have to deal with the predictable consequences of not getting involved. I think there were options. There's no guarantee that an active intervention, had it taken place in 2011, early 2012, would have made a difference. I don't think Assad is as powerful and as strong as some of the analysis suggests that he is. Reports are that about 15,000 Hezbollah fighters are doing some of the major heavy battle for the Assad regime, that if the regional support and the Russian support was not there, the Assad regime would not be as militarily powerful as some people think he is. That in and of itself suggests that there were options that could have pushed him, that could have made a difference on the ground. The one time that Assad conceded anything was when there was a serious threat of military force in September of last year, after he gassed some reports over 1,000 of his own people, and he seemed like he was, really trembling at the thought of what the consequences of even a limited American military strike would be, and he immediately conceded his entire, chemical weapons arsenal, an arsenal that he claimed that he didn't have or he didn't use the day before, but he conceded it over because there was a quid pro quo, and the quid pro quo was the Russian plan that, removed the threat of an American military strike, and Assad has emerged stronger as a result of that deal that was made. But there's also, I think, as I say in the essay, in the book, there are also very important, I think, political principles that have been violated at a deep level in the context of, Syria, in the context of the politics of the Arab world, in the context of the politics of the Arab Spring. Syrians rose up like other people did in the Middle East in the context of the Arab Spring, and they rose up for the very same sort of structural reasons. They were tired of political tyranny and despotism, and they wanted a better future. And for the first 6 to 8 months of this conflict, it was largely peaceful and nonviolent. And predictably, Assad behaved in the exact same way as many of us thought he would. He unleashed the full fury of his fascist regime on a civilian population, and predictably, it turned into a militarized conflict. And so to sort of stand back and see this conflict play out, it's really played out in the way that Assad has wanted it to play out. He's sort of changed the conversation away from democracy and dictatorship and accountability, and he's made the conversation all about Al-Qaeda and ISIS and extremism. That's not what this revolution was about. That's not how it began, but it has turned out that way, largely because of the policies of the Assad regime, but also because of the lack of, I think, critical support that could have been used to support at certain moments in time the opposition. I think before there was any ISIS or Jabhat al-Nusra sort of presence on the ground, there were alternatives. Had they been strengthened, it may not have worked, but I think fundamentally the people of Syria do have the right to self-determination, and that also includes the right to use military force, even if the odds and even if the social scientific literature suggests that you might not be successful. I think on basic moral principles that we are obligated to listen to people who are fighting a fascist regime, and even if the odds are against them, I think a moral case can be made that they should have been supported financially and militarily. And if we didn't want to intervene, that's fine. I think most Syrians would understand that. But I think there are moral and political arguments that can be made on both sides, looking back, where I think had there been sort of the right type of intervention, it may have. Mark may be right. We don't know. And we don't know if people such as myself who are arguing for intervention much earlier would have been right. Maybe we would not be facing the moral catastrophe that is taking place in Syria today. I mean, those are difficult questions. But what we do know is the consequences of not getting involved. And it's there in front of our eyes. And you look at all the statistics: the 100,000 people killed, 40% of the population displaced. The war crimes and crimes against humanity, largely due to Assad's policies. That's the good news. And I say that's the good news because the prognosis is that it's going to get worse. All the indications are the UN is predicting a doubling in the number of refugees over the next 12 months. The ripple effect of this is going to play itself out, and the consequences for America's interests, forget morality if you want for a side, just in terms of our interests, stability, our allies, the expansion of Al-Qaeda in the Middle East are going to be ones that we will be dealing with for many years to come. I have my own ideas in terms of where do we go from here. I don't want to take up any much more time, so I'll turn it back to Danny.
Thank you very much to all of you on the panel. Don, we had talked earlier about me calling on people maybe. I don't think I can do that because I can't really see people. Can we go back to the plan of, that's a little bit better, thank you. Okay. So thank you to all three of you for those comments. Let's move to a discussion now. Yes, Farah Hassan.
Thank you very much. For full disclosure, I'm a Syrian. Both sides of my family are from Aleppo. Just as an aside, before I ask my question, which I think is emblematic of where we are. A few years ago when people would ask me, because apparently I look ethnic and un-American, people would ask me, where are you from? And I'd say, well, my family's from Syria. And they'd say, oh, Syria, do you speak Farsi? Not exactly. And now when people ask me, oh, where are you from? And I say Syria, immediately the response is, I'm sorry. So unfortunately, I feel like we've gone from either as a people, as a state, being misunderstood in a lot of ways, to now being pitied, given the scenario. The question for the entire panel is, why do you all believe that the first attempt at, I'm going to say peace talks in quotes, Geneva in 2012, did not succeed? And do you have any reason to believe that the upcoming talks in Montreux will lead any kind of fruit, given the seemingly intractable positions of the regime, of Saudi Arabia and the other external powers, and the fractured opposition itself?
Thanks very much. Radwan, would you like to start with that?
Yes, but if I just have 2 minutes to respond to my close friend's Mark. Always in politics is not the questions between the good and the bad. Always the question between the bad and the worst. Any decision you will take, there will be consequences. And unfortunately, in such a region, in the Middle East, always you have to choose the decision actually you support and to run. What's happening also, it's quite different between you taking the position just watching and issuing statements, judging actions, and between shaping politics and shaping actions taken in the ground. What's happened in the US actually, just watching what's going on and issuing from time to time statements, making judge of things, which of course everyone predict things is not Syria, as I said, unique. That's happened before in former Yugoslavia, until the United States decided in 38 days in airstrikes to end the civil war there. And it can be the same in Syria if the United States have decision to have a limited airstrikes to end the Assad regime and end, of course, the war. What's happened in Syria, of course, everyone know the story that we are going from the bad to the worst. We decided from Ahrar al-Sham, and the armed group is very Salafi, fanatic group, then moved to the Al-Nusra, then ISIS, which Al-Qaeda funded group, and then we'll move to the global jihad. Will be Syria actually the hub of any terrorist group decided to make attacks not only in Lebanon and in neighboring countries, but maybe in the United States and in Europe. And every actually normal will see and answer the questions that Al-Qaeda is getting much more stronger now than before. And this is, of course, of the consequences of the policies of the Obama administrations and others not taking the issues in Syria seriously. And now Al-Qaeda actually have open borders, Iraq, Syria, and Lebanon. And they have actually very open flag of ISIS. And this is why it's, and the United States is watching just and not taking any actions to shape the things. Now the Free Syrian Army has a strong fight with Al-Qaeda. More than 700 Free Syrian Army leaders and fighters being killed by Al-Qaeda itself. And the United States is not even supported the actions of the Free Syrian Army, but even imagine how it's difficult for the Free Syrian Army to fight in two fronts. On the Assad regime from one hand, and Al-Qaeda, who's actually coordinated their efforts with the Assad regime in the other hand. Yesterday, as example, Al-Qaeda executed 80 of the fighters of the Free Syrian Army, which that's led, of course, for the first time, the Assad government to go to the city of Al-Raqqa, which being actually the Free Syrian Army was challenging that for almost 10 months. There is a coordinating war between the Assad government and Al-Qaeda, and actually the news is full of information about such coordinating work. This is why if we need to continue watching, not acting, it's of course nobody predict. what's in the next day. No, everyone predict what's happening in the next day will be actually, it's much more worse and much more worse. On the questions of I met with the Kofi Annan during his work on the peace plan and with Ibrahimi. Everyone has different approach. The idea that, as Mark said, that there is too much proxy power. The Geneva one built on the theory that let's bring all the international and the regional powers without insiders, without Syrians. I mean, the Geneva one built with no Syrians has been consulted. And Al-Ibrahimi plan right now should be actually mixed together. Have the insiders, the Syrians, along with the regional powers and the international, everyone in the table, and believe that everyone will save the interests of the Syrian people, that we should end the war and we have a peace. But things is not move like this, because who can convince the Assad regime to stop his ongoing? Who can actually build the trust between among the different groups in the Syrian opposition and have one address for them? It's not an easy answer. This is why I think it should be more effort, not only from the international, but from the United States. Still, the United States dealing with the Syrian issue and the level of a country needs aid. This is why everything happened in Syria. We increased the aid. We increased the aid. Now we started with 1 million refugees and displaced. Now we ended up with 8 million with the same policy, containing the crisis by increasing the aid. No, Syria is not an aid country, an aid need country. Syria has a political problem. It has to be solved by different aid, and this is why it's focusing on the policies that the United States is taking. Now we are paying the price of not acting, not shaping the evidence on the ground, rather than just watching, as Professor Mark is recommended.
Mark, go ahead.
Yeah, so, I mean, I was on 2 points, and then I'll say something about Geneva and Montreux. It's very easy to call something the moral thing to do because you see a tragedy unfolding and you want to do something. Everybody wants to do something. To act when social science or when your analysis tells you that your action is likely to fail or to have counterproductive results is not a moral action. It is not doing good if you try and do good, but you know that what you're going to do is going to make things worse. So, I mean, again, call me a consequentialist, but I do believe that you have to get your social science right. And again, Nader is absolutely right. We don't know. We're dealing with counterfactuals. We're dealing with scenarios, and we're trying to work these things out. But you have to at least be able to give a plausible argument by which your action leads to the desired result, and to be able to show that at some other cases, at some point in history, that's the way it actually happened. Bosnia didn't happen like that, Radwan. Bosnia was resolved because we armed the Croatian army, and the Croatian army swept in and defeated Serbia on the battlefield, and Slobodan Milosevic came to the negotiating table at Dayton because he had lost the war. And the airstrikes went on for months and months and months. And we proclaimed safe areas, and we could not protect them. And Muslims were slaughtered because we had made commitments to protect them, thinking we were doing the right thing, when in fact what we had done is we had gathered them into a place where they could then be slaughtered, and we couldn't protect them. So trying to do the right thing when it's not going to work is not a moral action. And I really strongly believe that. I think that the debate about Syria is not usefully cast in terms of morality. It's because I think everybody wants to do the right thing. It's a debate about what you're doing is going to achieve and whether it will actually achieve the desired results. And here's where Iraq has to be brought into this. It's not because I think Syria is the same as Iraq, but Iraq should have taught us that we can do things with good intentions and it doesn't go according to plan. That you can get involved in something and think that you're going to overthrow Saddam and leave in 18 days, and then 10 years later, you're still there, and everything which we know about Iraq has happened. And I think that that has affected certainly my thinking profoundly, having worked on trying to extricate the United States from that issue for many, many years. Yeah, it affected my thinking, and I think it should affect everyone's thinking about having a certain humility about our ability to control the effects of our actions. The argument about Al-Qaeda, certainly the presence of Al-Qaeda and ISIL is extraordinarily disturbing. I see absolutely no reason to believe that it has anything to do with whether the United States is there or not. Clearly, the United States being in Iraq was not a deterrent for Al-Qaeda to come in and start fighting. When Al-Qaeda sees an open battlefield in the heart of the Arab world where Sunnis are being murdered by what they consider to be apostates, the Shia, the Alawi, whatever, and there's open terrain and it's easy to get foreign fighters in, of course they're going to go there. If Assad fell tomorrow and the United States and the Free Syrian Army set up a transitional government, ISIL and Al-Qaeda will continue to fight because it's a perfect jihad for them. I honestly, I don't understand the argument that, that the presence of Al-Qaeda in Iraq is somehow a function of the United States not getting involved militarily. I mean, to me, I don't understand the argument at all. And then finally on Geneva and Montreux, I mean, I think Radwan, I think, is right about Geneva itself. I think that that was a top-down effort. I think that they thought that they had gotten quite close. And I know that Kofi Annan thought that he had gotten a deal, but that deal was never enforceable. And I think that's the mortal sin of the outside-in approach that I was recommending, is that even if you can get the people to the table, that doesn't mean that they can deliver their people on the ground. I think the prospects for success in the upcoming talks, if they ever happen, are even lower, simply because there's less control and less ability to deliver. It doesn't mean that it shouldn't be tried, but I'm no more optimistic than Radwan is, I don't think, about that actually leading to anything.
Nader, you want to chime in?
First to your question, I mean, the reason why the peace talks haven't produced peace is because of the battlefield conditions. Both sides are equally sort of think they can win the war militarily. Assad has no reason to concede anything, and his information minister said last month that if anyone thinks, I'm quoting the information minister, everyone thinks that we're going to Geneva to hand over the keys of Damascus to the opposition, they might as well not show up. And then he went to say that, you know, any transition, if there is going to be a transition, will be led by Assad. So as long as the battlefield conditions are such where the two sides think that they can win it out, nothing is going to happen as a result of the peace talks. But with respect to Marc's analysis, again, I have some serious disagreements. I mean, he draws upon Iraq as a lesson. I think, you know, we can also learn lessons that could produce different results from Libya. Again, Libya is not Syria, it's not Iraq, but I think there are lessons there in terms of how successful external intervention can help rebel groups that are fighting a brutal dictatorship. Marc invoked Bosnia. I think the lessons from Bosnia are far deeper and more extensive than the ones that he mentioned. I think what happened in Bosnia, what turned that conflict around, was because of because of the existence of a certain political will on behalf of the United States in particular to get involved in that conflict and steer it in a positive direction. For 3 years, Bosnia was producing a humanitarian catastrophe similar to Syria. In fact, in many ways, it was worse. It was, you know, overwhelmingly considered to be a genocide. And the United States really didn't want to get involved for almost the exact same reasons why it doesn't want to get involved in Syria. The arguments back then were there's no major American, you know, national interest that would force us to get involved. Yes, we have sympathy for the Bosnians. They're suffering. We don't like it, but it doesn't affect us. Well, that played out for 3 years. Then you had Srebrenica. You had the destabilization of a large part of southeastern Europe. You had the alliance between the United States and Europe fraying, and Clinton effectively made a 180-degree turn in his policy toward Bosnia and decided to get involved very heavily. We're here, you know, promoting a book, and so I'll use this opportunity to shamelessly promote the book. One of the essays in the book is by my current boss, the former U.S. ambassador to Macedonia and many other places, but also the right-hand man to Richard Holbrooke. When
Christopher Hill.
When Clinton decided to take on the Bosnian conflict, there was, again, similar to Syria, no guarantees. A lot of arguments were being made, just as they were in the case of Syria today, that this is going to go really bad. There were no guarantees that things would Not only was there a fight between the Serbs and the Croats and the Bosnians themselves had internal divisions. It looked very bad. But because of the investment in, I think, time, energy, and resources, and the willing to take on, yes, a substantial amount of risk, there was no guarantee. Clinton turned that conflict around. And Bosnia today, if you're following what's happening in Bosnia, is far from a perfect society, but it's a million times better than it was prior to the intervention that did take place. And the argument that Chris Hill makes in terms of, I think, the lessons that apply from Bosnia to Syria, it's not just a question of military intervention, supporting, bombing, arming one side. You have to have a much more comprehensive plan in place for what a political settlement will look like. You have to sort of engage the relevant parties. You have to sort of invest a considerable amount of resources, time, and energy, and accept the risk that it may not turn out the way you want it. But you have to make that decision. And everything that we know from the Obama administration with respect to Syria is they looked at what it would take to perhaps get involved in Syria in a substantive way and change that conflict around. And for many of the reasons that Mark sort of suggested, they saw that it wasn't worth the risk to get involved. Obama has said many times before he was elected to end wars, not start them. There was no public sentiment. I mean, one of the things that we learned from, I think, that we learned from the conflict in Syria and the debate in this country is just how heavy the legacy of the Iraq War has really shaped public opinion and policy making. I think many of the lessons are negative lessons. I don't think they necessarily apply, but obviously the debate in Syria and the absence of any clear policy position is deeply affected by the war in Iraq and in Afghanistan. But again, there are consequences to choices that we make. We decided, for better or for worse, not to get involved in Syria. I disagreed with those choices. I think there were arguments that could be made. There were case studies that we could invoke. There were sort of plans that could have been put in place that could have produced perhaps a more positive outcome. We didn't make those choices. Well, now we're dealing with the consequences. And we're just beginning to see the consequences. I think, as I said in my introductory remarks, the worst is yet to come.
Just one really quickly, one footnote on Bosnia, because I think it's really important to play this out. Mm-hmm. What happened in Bosnia, in addition to the long NATO airstrikes and the supporting the Croatian army to go in and defeat Serbia on the battlefield, was that Richard Holbrooke sat down with Milosevic, drank whiskey with him, and left him in power. And the equivalent of the Bosnia solution would be sending in John Kerry to have whiskey with Bashar al-Assad, leave him in power, and then send in a 100,000 strong international peacekeeping force like IFOR, which will stay there for the next 10 to 20 years. Now, again, that might be possible, but I have not heard anybody on any side express any political will whatsoever for any of those things. So again, if we're going to use Bosnia as the scenario, then we have to get Bosnia right, because that's, again, it's a footnote, but I think an important one.
And I think it's fascinating that you've both invoked Bosnia and have you're drawing different lessons from it. And Nader mentioned Chris Hill's essay in the book. There are actually 2 essays in the book that draw lessons from Bosnia. One by Ambassador Christopher Hill, which is called From Dayton to Damascus. It's a very interesting read. And the other one is by Michael Ignatieff, who, of course, whose views on these questions were very much formed by the Balkan Wars. Interestingly, both of them draw heavily on the Balkan experience, and they take different positions on Syria. Okay, Ignatieff argues for intervention, and Hill is essentially against it. So I think Bosnia, the shadow of Bosnia and Kosovo on one side are battling very much with the shadows of Iraq and Afghanistan on the other.
As we say in the introduction.
As we actually quote Michael Oren in the introduction, who said that, unfortunate source but poignant observation. And I would also just make one friendly amendment to what Mark said about Iraq, and I think you're right to invoke Iraq, Mark. But I think you mentioned sort of in passing that, with the best of intentions, look at how things went. I would actually argue that one huge difference between Iraq and Syria is that, in fact, the Iraq War was hatched not with the best of intentions, but with rather nefarious designs. We don't have to relitigate the Iraq War here. But one of the interesting things, Mohammed Idris Ahmad, a great journalist and critic in the UK, who writes about Syria, recently wrote a piece in which he compared Iraq and Syria, and he said, look, in Iraq you had to manufacture reasons to get involved and sell them through mendacity and propaganda. And in Syria it's almost the exact opposite. You have an abundance of suffering, and yet no sale is being made for it. So there are parallels and lessons to be drawn, but also profound and very stark differences, I would argue. Absolutely. Right. Now, I know you agree with that. I'm just pointing out that one issue of intentions I think really do matter. Look what you did, Farah. You popped this blister with one question that was about a 30-minute collective answer. Oh, no. Let's move on to our next question. Yes, right behind this gentleman here in the red. Yes.
Good evening. My question is, in your opinions, what is the strategic goal of the Assad regime? Does he actually have designs to get all of what we Westerners see as Syria back under his control? Or does he want to carve out a little enclave that will still be controlled by Alawites and then leave the rest of it to some sort of Sunni control? I mean, it's a minority ruling majority. Does he really think it's going to go back to the old ways, or is he just trying to preserve some sort of control, some sort of existence beyond the current chaos? What are your opinions on what he's thinking? Because in the Western media, we only see things from our moral vantage point, but never what is he thinking in his bunker as things are unfolding.
Radwan, would you like to take the first stab at that?
Yes, because exactly take us to the questions about the character of the Assad, how you see the Assad. And of course, that brings us the same of the question of Bosnia. When Holbrooke said with the Milosevic, at that time he still believed that Milosevic, it can be part of the solution. Until what's happened in Srebrenica, then he decided to move that Milosevic is a part of the problem. And this is exactly where actually we should understand the issue. It's that the use of the chemical weapons in Eastern Ghouta shows we are not dealing with just a dictator. We are dealing with a genocidal guy who can use whatsoever with the Syrian army to kill as much Syrian he can do. We see every day that's on the rise of the toll, in the type of the weapons he's been used. This is that when we have a genocidal person in power, no one can predict exactly the number of the casualties. No can predict even. It's sometimes actually in Africa, the number of the refugees usually push the international community to do actions rather than the question of the casualties. And now we have more than 4 million Syrian refugees in the neighboring countries, which that's mean instability, because 1/3 of Lebanon. Just imagine if we moved all the population of Chicago to Indiana, what will happen? Exactly, this is the question where actually 1/3 of the Lebanese people are Syrians. Then the question of the resources, the question of, and this is why the question of instability, not only in Syria, it's been in Jordan, in Lebanon, in Iraq, in Turkey. And if there is no international coordinated efforts to address the issue of the instability in the region, I don't think that anyone can predict what will happen in the future.
Yeah, just very.
Feel free to take a pass.
It's a simple answer to your question. He's trying to survive first and foremost, and he's trying to ride out this war to last as long as possible and gain as much territory as possible, and to prevent any external intervention that could disrupt his rule from power. And exactly that has been playing out. So I think Assad's strategy, sadly, and it also his other strategy is to change the conversation. In 2011, the conversation in Syria was all about the Arab Spring demands: democracy, accountability, transition to a better future, human rights, etc. Who's talking about that anymore? Everyone is talking about exactly what Assad wants us to talk about: Al-Qaeda, political stability. I'm the more moderating force, given all the other options. So he's effectively won, and he just wants to ride this out, hoping to regain as much territory as he can. And he's got strong backing. And of course, this is all happening because there is no counterforce that can prevent him from his havoc and his atrocities and his war crimes. And so that's why we're having this conversation.
Okay. Yes, good idea. I see a hand up in the back, the woman in the back, and then right here. Next, yes. Please.
Good evening. I was Okay, sorry. Good evening. I believe the Syrian conflict is really international, and that's why my question has to do with the rapprochement between Iran and the U.S. recently. How do you assess the impact of that on the Syrian conflict?
Well, Nader being our Iranian
Very
on the
quickly.
panel and also an expert on this question, I'm going to defer to him.
There's a lot of discussion about sort of positive things that can flow for the Syrian conflict as a result of the dialogue and the nuclear agreement with Iran. I don't take that position. I think these are completely two separate tracks. I think Iran has negotiated a nuclear deal with the United States in the P5+1 for reasons that are internal to the stability of the regime and the fear of the collapse of its own economy. When it comes to Syria, it's a completely different set of calculations. And you know, just because the United States and Iran are talking doesn't mean that Iran is going to concede anything in Syria. And why should it? Because Iran's side is winning. Assad has been in power. He's ridden out this wave of atrocities. He seems to be getting stronger. The opposition is fragmented and is getting weaker. So I don't think that there's anything that the Iranians need to do in terms of their Syria policy that would force them to compromise or concede, because from their perspective, things look a lot better today than they did 6 months ago. And I don't think there's any strong arguments that the United States can really advance to persuade the Iranians to sort of change policy. So I think they're completely different tracks. I don't think they're necessarily linked just because there has been this historic conversation and nuclear agreement.
But hasn't Iran lost a lot of its favor in the Sunni Arab world that it enjoyed? Let's dial back the clock to the summer of 2006 during the Israeli invasion of Lebanon. Ahmadinejad and Nasrallah were the two most popular figures, two Shiites, right. One non-Arab, were the two most popular figures on the so-called Arab street. Yeah. Now flash forward.
Yeah, Iran's soft power in the region as being sort of the champion of the Palestinians and challenging Western policy. That was a big part of its sort of propaganda and foreign policy. And it had to sort of, it's paid a cost for that, because it's no longer, it's viewed as sort of a champion of a sectarian regime right now.
And specifically a regime which has now gassed its own population with chemical weapons, a major issue in Iranian political culture.
And similarly to Hezbollah, who had that same reputation as being sort of an independent fighting force and being able to, their reputation and street credibility within the larger Arab world has been significantly compromised because they are now effectively backing the Assad regime. So yes, Iran, they had to make that calculation. And I see no internal debate within the Iranian senior leadership. I mean, the political leadership, the Rouhani government in Zarif, I think, would like to have some sort of diplomatic settlement. But I think the people who make the national security decisions in Iran, the supreme leader, the Revolutionary Guards, they have been strongly backing Assad, and there's no indication that support has diminished in any way or that it will in the future.
So it may not have affected the Islamic Republic's calculations. However, it's quite clear that it affected the Obama administration's calculations, and I'd like to hear Marc Lynch's thoughts on this in particular, as something of an advisor to the Obama administration. I mean, not officially, Mark, but you're probably the only one on this panel with that who's played that kind of role in the past. And I specifically, there are reports that the Obama administration kicked the decision about a Syria strike in September to Congress because Iran made it very clear through back-channel negotiations that had there been a strike on Syria, they would have pulled out of the nuclear negotiations. And that could have played a major role in Obama's thinking about what to do on Syria, no?
That might have been part of it, but I think the bigger part of it is that he didn't want to go to war with Syria, and he talked himself into a corner and was looking for a way to get out of it. And I think it was extremely poorly managed, but at the end, at least, we didn't go to war with Syria. And I think that's basically, that's the bottom line. I think the Iran stuff might have played some, been there on the margins, more along the lines of, this is something that I actually want to do, and so it might have played into it, but I don't think it was the driving force. I think that Nader is absolutely right about how the Syria issue plays in Iran right now. I mean, there's no question about it that there's a divide between, and Rouhani and Zarif have been very clear about this. They are not empowered to talk about Syria. That's not their file. At the same time, it's hard for me to believe that if this actually works and if the relationship between the U.S. and Iran changes, that this doesn't have spillover effects on a whole range of areas that are currently kind of not not negotiable, whether it's Iraq or Syria or others. So I think you're absolutely right about the state of play as it is right now, but that doesn't mean that 3 months from now, 6 months from now, a year from now, if U.S.-Iranian relations get significantly better, that this wouldn't have spillover effects elsewhere. I saw Ray Taki had a piece which I think captures a lot of the conventional wisdom right now that we can get a nuclear deal, and it's just a nuclear deal, and we keep fighting a Cold War every place else. I don't find that very likely. I kind of feel like we get a deal and it snowballs, or we don't get a deal. I think those are the more likely outcomes. But at either rate, I just wanted one thing which I've heard a number of times, that Assad is winning, Iran is winning. I don't think this is right. I mean, I think it's only half right. And it gets to your question from before. Assad is winning because he's surviving. And that's the extent of his ambitions. I think Hezbollah is significantly weaker now than it was before. It's exposed. It has limited manpower, which is now fighting in Syria. It's isolated inside of Lebanon far more than it ever was before. It's under much greater pressure than it ever was before. I think I used this in a column once. I mean, basically, when Hezbollah entered Syria, this is like sending your queen out from behind the wall of pawns. It's now exposed, it's vulnerable, and it's weak, and you only get to make that play once. And so I don't think that Hezbollah is stronger for being involved in Syria, and Iran I don't think is stronger for being involved in Syria. Again, this is a drain on it with the Sunni world. It's much, the sectarianism across the region has many horrible negative effects. But one of the effects is that it sharply limits Iran's appeal around the Arab world. I don't think that Iran is ascendant at the moment. I don't think Hezbollah is ascendant at the moment. I think Assad is winning in narrow terms because he's surviving. But I think what we've seen is, like, he tries to push into Aleppo, and he gets a little bit of the way and then gets pushed back to the old status quo line. Meanwhile, he loses territory someplace else because basically he's able to survive, but he can't defeat the opposition. So it's still a stalemate, and I don't see that as them winning, unless you define it in that very narrow sense of winning by not losing, which I think probably is exactly how he defines it.
Defining winning down, if you will.
Well, yeah, but I mean, the idea of kind of insurgency theory has always been that the insurgents have the advantage because they only have to survive to win. But in this case, I think Assad has that same. Right. I mean, in both cases, if the opposition survives, it wins, and if Assad survives, he wins, and that creates a mutually satisfying stalemate at the expense of everybody else.
I think it's fair to say, though, that it helps Assad that the opposition is now fighting itself.
Oh, absolutely.
That there's a civil war within the civil war. Yes, right there. Yes, sorry, please.
Thank you to the panel for your insights. I'd like to ask Marc a question. You talked about the outside-in approach, and whilst I would share your pessimism on that, I wonder whether you could elaborate more on what do you think are the key issues that need to be addressed in order to cajole the external actors on both sides of the conflict to come together and reach some sort of a negotiated agreement.
And I'd also like to hear what Radwan thinks about that and other. But I think that so basically, I mean, what I see has been the problem from the beginning is that the actors involved on kind of the good guy side have profoundly different objectives. I think for some of them, it's about reaching a political solution and a transition and stopping the humanitarian catastrophe. For some of them, it's about overthrowing Assad. For some of them, it's just about bleeding Iran and fighting Iran to the last dead Syrian. And for some of them, it's about fighting with each other, the Saudis and the Qataris, in their endless jockeying for influence. And so the problem then is that you have this misalignment of goals and objectives and kind of intensity of preferences that makes it extraordinarily hard. And the U.S. has actually been doing, for years, has been trying to turn this into a kind of a unified opposition supporting negotiating position and has completely failed at it. In fact, I think one of the strongest arguments for the U.S. arming the opposition has nothing to do with the effects on the ground. It was simply the argument that if the U.S. is the big dog in the game in funding the insurgency, then that will then get everyone else, the Saudis and the Qataris and the Turks, to line up behind them, which I think you do need in order to get the goals you're talking about. The problem with that, of course, is that, the Saudis are in a position to throw $5 billion, $10 billion, just by, waking up in the morning. That's not the way it works here. And so the idea that we would be able to get in the game in such a dominant way that we would crowd out the other suppliers was always fairly implausible to me. But that was the strongest argument, I always thought, for trying to get involved in the arming game, was simply because that would allow you to better coordinate on the outside. But so far, that's not really happening, and now you're seeing all the same stuff going on with the different goals and the different foreign objectives. And then on the other side, basically the same answer that I gave a minute ago about Iran, they would have to conclude that their regional interests are best served by changing their Syria position, and whether they'll get to there, I think it's largely dependent on the nuclear question. Although, again, I do think they're separate issues.
Radwan, did you want to
Yes. I never been argued for arming the opposition.
Yeah.
And Mark knows that, because if you arm, of course, you never be able to control. My position was actually, when I studied actually 16 countries who are in civil war, and you arm the opposition, you'll never succeed actually to overthrow a central government, except in Sierra Leone, which actually
Sierra Leone.
Sierra Leone. Except at that time the central government was very weak, and actually the French backed the armed opposition heavily day by day. But it's never been the case in any of these 16, and this is why it's not the issue of arming. The issue actually how to tip the balance by taking an actions by the limited airstrikes or the no-fly zone. But the United States decided not to do any of these, taking the counter arguments from each side, actually took not to do anything, which of course that this is a position for the United States not to act in any way. And now we are in a position actually none of the sides has a central decision. Even the Assad government, no, the Assad government now have 5 militias fighting with the Assad government. You have Hezbollah militias, you have Abu al-Fadl Abbas with the Shia Iraqi militias, and everyone has his own strategy. If you see one of the videos when actually the Shia, Iraqi Shia militias control Al-Buwaida, it's one of the small cities in Damascus suburbs, and one of the fighters there raised the photo of Bashar al-Assad, and one of the fighters that cut the hand, and said, if your army control the area, you can raise the photo of Bashar, but we control it. Those different Shia militias has own strategy. With the same time, of course, the Hezbollah, who's been actually, I think, Hezbollah, it's draw his end in Syria. Because even in the argument, when you have Hassan Nasrallah saying every time we are sending our fighters into Syria actually to save Palestine. It's Palestine much more closer if you go direct. You don't need to go actually into Syria to go to Israel or Palestine. It's such repeating such argument every time. It gives that how much the Hezbollah has lost any influence within the Arab community. This is why this is my argument supporting the Geneva, why Geneva is important. At least to have a political table. No one will stick to the table. Back and forth, but at least you have an early political table, it's good. Because those actually, the normal years of civil war is 7 to 10 years. And the Syrian, they cannot actually suffer that with all the number of casualties, the refugees. This is why it's important to have a political. Then the issue, how much this political table has the interest of the international community. Until now, I don't see any interest among the United States. Secretary Kerry is more interested in having peace between the Israeli and the Palestinian, rather than actually solving the Syrian issues. And if you go the number of people working within the State Departments on the Arab-Israeli or on the Palestinian-Israeli, because none of the Arab states supporting the Kerry initiative to have a peace talks right now, rather than focusing on end of what's going on in Syria. This is why when actually you have the United States have its own own world, not actually working according to the agendas on the region. This is why if first you have successful Geneva, you have to move the interest of the international community, the interest of the United States, to take the issue of Syria seriously and to work on that day by day, then have some results. Otherwise, I don't see that just putting the Syrians on the table in Geneva, everyone shouting on each other, I don't think that will present any good outcome.
Okay. Why don't we take one last question, maybe two if there's time, depending on how long our answer goes. Okay, right here. Yes, I see one right here and then one right there. Yes, right in front here.
What are your thoughts on the argument that the Syria that we know today from a geographical context will cease to exist in the future based on reports that strategic genocides are being carried out in different areas of the country, and that basically it'll carve out a Shiite state from Lebanon through southern Syria into Iraq and Iran?
So does anyone want to respond to that? Yeah, why don't we take
She's
one
had her
more?
hand up
Yes.
for a long time.
Yes, please.
I'm an unemployed Arabist, so I don't really have any answers. But this is clearly an antecedent with colonial ramifications. Who is benefiting from the chaos now in Syria, and what would there be against an argument to look at the Golan and look at a comprehensive disengagement and demilitarization in the Middle East in general? I think that the proxies are actually forces with which there is a bit of leverage. There aren't many resources in Syria to the extent that there were in Iraq. And I think that the language needs to be adjusted to look at more of a comprehensive conflict resolution model to demilitarizing a larger Middle East, and look at Israel-Palestine as an antecedent of this larger conflict in Syria. And I think it can't be disaggregated. I think it's kind of part of the same thing. And I think that there are forces that truly are benefiting from the chaos in Syria and also the chaos now in Lebanon and the fragility in Jordan. I think it is related to Israel-Palestine, and I think that Iran is an important player, but I think it's much broader and it needs to be less parochial.
Thank you for that observation. Should we take one more, perhaps, before we have a final kind of wrap-up and set of comments from our panel? I see this gentleman right here in the front. Thank you.
Yeah, I was just wondering, with everything that we're talking about and that we've seen over the years, I feel like the inarguable thing is that there's refugees and there's millions of them, and you know those numbers are going to obviously grow. So I was just curious, maybe just from a U.S. perspective, but you could go for a world perspective too, what the game plan is for dealing with that. As far as, yeah, I mean, if it's hard to find a good position, I feel like taking the position of caring for the people is inarguable. So what are we doing about that?
Yeah, and maybe if I could just add to that and maybe put a slightly sharper point on that question. And this is sort of a question for you, Mark. I think on the macro level, the macro strategic level, there's no consensus at this table or anywhere else for that matter on what is to be done. There are no very coherent, let alone compelling, policy prescriptions. On the other hand, what about looking at more micro-strategic solutions of specific, smaller, if you will, a minimalist program to deal with very concrete humanitarian nightmares, like something that Nader mentioned in his opening comments, the starvation sieges of dozens of Syrian towns where hundreds of thousands, arguably 1.5 million Syrians, civilians, at this moment, are starving, are suffering from malnutrition. We now see the outbreak of polio. Because of these military blockades of these dozens of towns, humanitarian supplies, medicine, doctors, food cannot get into these towns. People are literally starving. What about the idea, it's hinted at in the book by both Ken Roth and Mary Kaldor, of creating humanitarian corridors, or insisting as a precondition, and this has come up recently in the run-up to Geneva or to Montreux, the idea that you would have to coercively establish entry for humanitarian aid and food to get into these besieged areas of Syria, and that you would need a force that could just tackle that one issue, not who's going to govern Syria, not which side of the opposition do you support, simply the question of getting food and medicine into these towns, and doing so in a way that would have consequences, that would have military backing behind it. Would you support something like that?
Of course not. I mean, that's war. Sending armed corridors into a country to whether it's to deliver humanitarian assistance or anything else is a war. You've now entered their land and you're fighting your way in. And to do that and then to not actually fight the war would be strategically insane, I think. So if you're going to fight a war and win the war. But the idea of humanitarian corridors always struck me as an unusually bad one, because basically what you're doing is you're creating a whole set of commitments, promises. Basically, if you set a humanitarian corridor, you're saying, okay, refugees, come to this area and we'll protect you. Okay, then they start shooting at them. What do you do?
But this is different because we're talking about dozens of towns where there are already civilians starving and who need food and medicine.
So what I would say is that I actually agree completely with the prior, before you got to the part about the corridors, because I think that a ceasefire and humanitarian access should be exactly what we should be focusing on, and I think that the idea of using humanitarian assistance and basic human rights and human needs is probably the best way to deal with something, but it would have to be through a negotiated process and consensual on both sides. Aid organizations won't go in if it's not negotiated in consensual fashion with the Syrian government. Just talk to them, talk to the aid organizations, and they would see this as politicized, and they would steer clear of it, and I think rightly so. Whereas if it's a question of a negotiated deal calling for a ceasefire, humanitarian access, that actually then begins the process of de-escalation, and I think should be a necessary part of anything which could follow from a Geneva, Montreux, or anything else. The problem with it gets to one of the other, I can't remember who asked which question, I'm sorry, but the question of who benefits from it, because there's a lot of people who benefit from the war. Why is there a war? Because people want to fight the war, because they see their interests as best served by fighting the war. Assad perhaps believes that fighting the war is the best way for him to stay in power. The opposition believes that fighting the war is the best way to overthrow Assad, or to continue to get support from the outside, or to maintain the local power that they have in a particular village. I mean, there's all kinds of interests and reasons which sustain a civil war once it gets going. And in order to break that, you need to actually stop the fighting and start unwinding those those realities. And so I think that the first part of both of your interventions, I completely agree with, which is that some form of a humanitarian focus before talking about issues of the composition of a future Syrian government, the nature of a transitional government. I think this stuff is stuff that should be absolutely prioritized, but if that becomes the leading edge of essentially of a military intervention, then you might as well just go straight for the military intervention and overthrow Assad and deal with the consequences.
I think it's a point well taken. Mary Kaldor's argument would be, let's focus on the humanitarian dimension and the civilians, but what happens if Assad's government simply refuses to allow the humanitarian workers in? Then what does the international community do? Is there not a responsibility to protect and to get food to those civilians at whatever cost? And her argument is that there could be force required that would not be about taking sides in the ultimate conflict.
I mean, the simple answer, how you to protect the civilians. It then goes back to the same argument, you have to take a military action. I mean, this argument simply, it's need, of course, a military backing. Because from the day one, who's killing the peaceful protesters? It's clear that the security forces of the Assad government. Then if you need to protect them, how to protect them? At least you have to have forces on the ground, not allowing the Assad to open fire or to shoot the peaceful protesters. And that's the simple answer which no one wants to take that time. But struck me as a Syrian how the international community dealt with the Syrians as a game. Because if you go back to history, actually, the Arab League sent observers to know exactly who's open the fire on the protesters. And that process takes 3 months. Then, of course, ended up to the failed disaster mission of the Arab League. Then the United Nations decided to send again observer, not just to tell who's actually the open fire on the protesters. Even we have, the Syria revolution is the most documented revolution in history. We have more than 1.5 million YouTubes. And actually in our work, we have every victims, we have actually a YouTube, how they were being killed, and in which city, the name, and how he's buried. And this is why and the question before in Bosnia and in Rwanda, there is lack of information. Now you have large amount of information because the revolution of the social media, and it doesn't actually reflect it on the actions, how to take or the tackle of the issues. This is why always back to the same questions when you have a lack of political will. The lack of political will, that means you will not be able to deal with the humanitarian issue, you will not be able to deal with the political issues, or none of these issues. You need exactly to build a political will within the international community or within the states to be able to deal with the issue seriously. Last week, the Russian blocked just a presidential statement, non-binding presidential statement from the Security Council, just to on the issues of barrel bombings in Aleppo. I mean, this is a simple issue.
Barrel bombing.
Barrel bombings, where actually the Russians is blocking of having something like that, and they never agrees on small issues like the humanitarian assistance and all of that. There is an interest of the Russians, of course, to keep the fighting and to keep the Assad in power, at least to be part of the civil war, part of the game, not actually to be thrown or drawing out of the game.
Any final comments, Mark or Nader, before we close up?
I'll try and just briefly answer the 3 questions at the end. Look, this question about a Shiite state from Latakia and Syria all the way to Iran, I think that at this stage is a fantasy. That state will never be recognized by anyone, you know, so I think it's completely hypothetical. I mean, if the sectarian war in the Middle East completely continues the way that it's heading, who knows what's going to happen? But that's not going to emerge as a state that anyone in the world is going to recognize in any serious way. So I hope it doesn't happen. I don't think that will lead to anything positive for the region or for the people who live there. The second question with respect to demilitarization of the Middle East, look, I'm very sympathetic to the sentiment behind the question. But I think you're trying to link it to the Israel-Palestine conflict, link Syria to the Israel-Palestine conflict. I don't see that linkage. In terms of your broader call for demilitarizing the entire Middle East, yeah, that's a nice sentiment, but we can't even deal with one particular conflict in the Middle East with respect to Syria, trying to demilitarize that one, let alone the entire region. So I'm not really sure what practical sort of policy prescriptions can emerge from the very genuine sentiments that were behind your question. But I think the last one is the most interesting one, and it comes back to what we were just discussing about the need to address humanitarian suffering. I think Marc is essentially right. I mean, the way that you deal with this, there's already two ways. One, you go through the UN Security Council and you get some mandate from the UN Security Council, which then would also require the Syrian government's permission to have aid convoys enter into their territory. And they will, decide yes or no whether they want aid to be distributed to suffering populations. The other way is to invoke responsibility to protect and say, look, we don't care what the Syrian regime wants. We are going to address humanitarian suffering, and if the Syrian regime tries to stop us from delivering humanitarian aid, we will attack it. But if you're going to go down that route, why deal with the humanitarian aid issue to begin with? Just deal with the Assad regime and save everyone, deal with the root causes, in other words, not with the symptoms of the war. But, of course, for anything positive to happen in terms of either addressing the humanitarian aid issue or the larger roots of the conflict, it comes back to what has been already discussed on this panel. You need political will by the major actors who at least have the theoretical capability and capacity to get involved. But as we have seen, the interest or the will, particularly on behalf of the Obama administration, despite the very pressing humanitarian crisis that is unfolding, is going to get worse, just is not there. And I don't see anything changing, at least in the short term, that will affect the Obama administration's position. And I'm of the view, unless decisions change in this city with respect to the Syrian conflict, nothing substantively is going to really change in a positive way that will affect the outcome of this tragedy that's unfolding before our eyes.
Marc, please.
Can I say just one last thing? I didn't actually get to your question about the refugees, because I think that it's very easy for us to go and have this argument that we always have and get tied up into the knot of hopelessness about humanitarian corridors into Syria and all of that. But let's not forget all of the refugees who are outside of the country who need help and can be helped. And the United States has actually been one of the most generous donors to refugees. Kuwait has been a very generous donor to refugees, and almost everybody else in the world has been shamefully unwilling to pony up money to support refugees outside, and that's something which could be done without invoking any of these complexities that we've been talking about. It's very easy to simply give money to stand up refugee camps, to provide social services, health services, psychological services in Turkey, in Jordan, in Lebanon, and every place that Syrian refugees go. Asylum policies could be changed. There's all kinds of things that can be done for the refugees without having to touch any of these complexities that we're talking about. And frankly, I'd like to see a lot more of that done, no matter what happens in the rest of this debate.
It's good to end on something of a positive note. I want to thank Marc Lynch and Radwan Ziadeh in particular for joining us this evening, and I want to thank everyone here for coming and posing such stimulating questions, engaging questions for us this evening. I want to thank Don Allen and the great team here at Teaching for Change and Busboys and Poets. What an honor to be here in this room, in this fine establishment, which is really an institution, not only in Washington, D.C., it's known nationally now. It's a huge honor for us to have partnered with Don, with Teaching for Change and Busboys and Poets tonight. I know that Nader and I will be sticking around. We can sign copies of the book. We'll also be hanging out and having a couple of drinks, so perhaps we can continue the conversation. I also just want to put in a quick plug for Marc Lynch's Middle East channel on foreignpolicy.com, which about maybe 1/3 of the pieces in this book came from. It is really the, I think, source in the English language on a day-to-day level for high-level analytic pieces, think pieces about what's happening in the Middle East. I just really suggest that you sign up for the emails, follow it on Twitter, what have you, Middle East channel. And thank you all for being here tonight.
It's true.